So thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I'm really excited to have Farrah here and everybody else here. Thank you. So I'm Laura Sargent, events manager at the Davis Center, and so happy to welcome you at this opening for exhibition and artist talk, which is called "The Things We Shared." The stories from Uzbekistan cotton's field this we kind of added for the center, and featuring work of Farrah Karapetian. So before we begin, I want to thank the Davis Center for providing this space where art can live alongside research in the social and political sciences, because that's what we do. Our center's work spans across Russia, Eastern.
We go into practice session. Yeah.
No, we're still recording. Yeah. It's all right. Yeah,
let's get this.
Okay, so our work, so our center's work spans across Russia, Eastern Europe, Baltic states, Central Asia, and Caucasus. So special thanks to Chris Martin, who is interim executive director, and Maria Altamore, who actually supported this kind of initiative, small exhibits in the center. And of course, my colleagues who are here and for supporting me, and all of you who are here. So Farrah's work is held in major museums, collections, including Getty Museum, Los Angeles County Museum of Art, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and has been supported by institutions like Paula Krasner and Fulbright Foundations. She's also an accomplished writer with work published in Brooklyn Rail, Art Forum, and Los Angeles Review of Books, and the recipient of Warhol Arts Writers Grant. She's associate professor at the University of San Diego and active in supporting transnational artistic exchange, particularly across borders in Central Asia, Russia, and Mexico. Her current exhibition explores personal memory and labor through cyanotypes and silver gelatin prints, which hopefully you saw already, reflecting on cotton harvest in Uzbekistan. The work challenges traditional documentary forms and brings forward voices often left out of official narratives. Farrah is joined by Madison Brown for conversation following her presentation. And Madison is a writer and curator whose research explores amateur media cultures at the intersection of archives, memory, and everyday life. She received her PhD in screen cultures from Northwestern University and is currently the John and Barbara Robinson Family Curatorial Fellow in Photography at Harvard Art Museum. So please join me welcoming. And thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm really thrilled you are here. So
thank you. I'm going to share. I hope everyone here did get a chance to see the work in the hallway, and hopefully also when you leave, you'll see it again and with new eyes. I will start with that work just to go over again what's here, and then we'll see the rest of the body of the work kind of at the end of the presentation after I show you kind of some stuff that it's based on. So this is called Pay Locals, and it is a cyanotype, despite the fact that it's blue. Despite the fact that it's pink. There are traditional cyanotypes are often understood to be cyan, blue, but they actually make different kind of colored ones as well. So this whole thing is a cyanotype made from collage, contact printed to scale, and it tells a story. That was actually the only mashup story in the body of work. Most of the stories that I made pictures from were individual narratives, like moments, really banal moments from inside someone's story. This one, though, kind of embodied a collection of notes that people had told me about how, after having been bussed into the regions from the cities, they would oftentimes just, and this is in the later years of harvesting, kind of 80s stories mostly. They would pay locals who were better trained in or just more practiced in picking the cotton, and so they could fill the quota faster. And so over here, you see these guys kind of relaxing in the field. A lot of people talked about having cognac, learning to drink cognac. So they're relaxing, having paid a local laborer to do the work for them. And when I get to another of the slides, I think I have notes as to like the actual narrative someone said about that. And I'm going back to Uzbekistan in a couple weeks to the Fergana Valley, and I hope this time to get regional perspective, because so many of these stories were told by urban dwellers. That, you know, I was hearing about activities like this or habits like this, and I would love to know from the other side, what that microeconomy looked like for them. So the kind of urban versus rural aspect of this project has yet to be completed. But these are also some of the objects, the things they shared that these people from the cities were saying that they ended up sharing once they were out there in the fields. They would share cognac, they would share toilet paper, they would share water, cigarettes, and chocolate. Those were some of the major recurring themes of, here we are in this dwelling, oftentimes, very spare dwelling, sometimes no window, no door. And there was never any toilet paper. So they would like find toilet paper and share it, or find chocolate and treats and share it. So as I was making this body of work, and you'll see the way it began again at the very end, I was trying to think about how to communicate these banalities as significant. And I really saw this as kind of this part of the series as kind of a typology of personal experience, as opposed to the kind of typology that institutions usually make. If you picture an anthropological photograph like this one, down here, you'll see the Russian Imperial Album of Turkestan, where Russian imperial officers were going through making these albums to create typologies around how people live. In this case, how they handled cotton. This is how they do this with cotton. This is how they do this with cotton. Also explorers were mapping the region, right? And they were doing this throughout Central Asia, Turkestan. Over here, you'll see the same things had started to happen in Mexico, with, in fact, some of the same people. So if you look at this timeline, which, those of you who are familiar with the timeline of Central Asia, maybe some of this stuff is a given. But in 1911, Russia accepted this proposal from the United States as far as how to work on developing irrigation plans in Turkestan. And this guy, Arthur Pell Davis, was part of that proposal. And he's the one who also worked on the Colorado River near my house in San Diego. And so the more I got into the project, the more the parallels between the regions started to become clear. I went to Uzbekistan because of Langston Hughes. And that is this trip up here. 1932, he went with a group of Black American actors to make a movie in Moscow, which didn't get made, and the Soviet government sent all the actors home via whatever route they wanted, and he went home through Central Asia because he had heard that socialism was developing there in such a way that was helping to desegregate, and he was very, very excited about the opportunity to see the cotton fields. And when he got there, he really thought that people were now picking cotton for themselves rather than for the Turkish Beys. So he came home to California and wrote a play called Blood on the Cotton, which was about like the strikes on the cotton fields in California, Mexico, kind of modeled after the play that Umarjan Ismailov had written in 1930 that he had seen on his trip about the development of the kolkhoz in the cotton context, the collectivization of cotton. So I was already aware that there was a link between California and Uzbekistan, between Mexico and the United States relationship and Russia and Uzbekistan relationship, just because I had read this bit about Langston Hughes. But I didn't know until very recently that, in fact, our irrigation scientists, our engineers had worked on the same the projects in both countries. I knew that there were crates coming back and forth between the countries. I didn't know literally the same guy. So I was looking at these two kinds of ways of forming maps and taxonomies of the region as if it's kind of an othered, very much so, place. I was also looking at the other kinds of photographs that were made that weren't so much like taxonomies or mapping, but that were simply like glorifying industrial scale irrigation. On the right, you have Dorothea Lange doing it on my border, the All-American Canal. Which was built, the All-American Canal, which was built to take the Colorado River from the Mexican side and put it on the American side. And Margaret Bork-White, who was not in Uzbekistan at this time, but she had gone in 1930 and a few times after that to look at industrialization in Russia. So these female American photographers taking pictures of industrialization as if it's just amazing in both Russia and California. And then, of course, these photographs with which you may be more familiar, since these are actually kept here. This is Max Alpert, and Max Penton also took photographs of the Fergana Canal's construction. And obviously, the pictures coming from the Soviet perspective are always about like just what fun you're having while you're building a canal by hand. You know, the singers come out to entertain, and it's really about like portraying the situation as if it's a self-motivated people's movement. At the same time, over here in the American context, the photographs that were going to motivate funding for our kinds of programs around farming and cotton were far more on the sad side, right? So if this is happy, this is sad. This was how we were going to use propaganda to motivate our people. And we don't necessarily talk about these pictures in photo history as if propaganda per se, you know, Dorothea Lange's photographs of the cotton harvest. But you can see that they're both trying to motivate a people to support a state project of industrialized irrigation and otherwise. There were also, the avant-garde in the Soviet Union is sometimes seen to have kind of been cut abruptly from the project of socialist realism that you see on the left, but not completely in this context, right? So Rodchenko is photographing in Uzbekistan, and Stepanova is designing the book called 10 Years of Soviet Uzbekistan. And you can still see Rodchenko like looking at the world through angles that are supposed to disrupt your kind of banal way of seeing industrialization. So if Margaret Bork-White was glorifying it by looking at it, head on, he's glorifying it still by looking at an angle, which kind of stops a couple years later when Stalin really got serious. I want to also share briefly, that's kind of the photographic context that I'm referring to in the work. So if I'm referring to silver gelatin prints, I'm trying to say that these are the prints that I'm referring to. And if I'm referring to cyanotypes, I'm talking about an early process in photography, which isn't terribly represented here, but something early that kind of dates from a time of imperial expansion and taxonomies in science and that kind of thing. But my work actually comes more from the tradition of the cameraless photograph. And those are all cameraless in the hallway in this body of work, but they don't quite read as a photogram. So just to give you a little like vocabulary, I've always been interested in like how people receive imagery in public space, right? Like in Grecian pediments, you see the most important things to the society at that time fixed in a frieze on a building. We see it in billboards. We see it in our social media streams. And this was 2011. There were a lot of protests all over the world. This was riot police in Kyrgyzstan being stoned by protesters. And I saw their bodies as that kind of pedimentary shape, the triangle of the pediment. And so I asked friends to come in and kind of live with that shape just for the duration of the photogram session so that we could inscribe their body. So this is a life-size print of their shadows, right? You can kind of see how that would have been made with photo paper behind them. So everything started with this kind of performative reenactment of media images, where we're spending more time with something that is otherwise really fleeting. That's what it looks like in a room. So it's at your body's scale. You have a way of tuning into it physically. They have a way of tuning into it physically. And it's not the documentary image that that purports to objectivity. It's something where we're really getting involved together. I've also always been interested in objects as part of how we tell stories about major events, personal or political. So the things they shared seem like really banal things. It's chocolate, it's toilet paper, but for them, it tells the story of like, you know, what they didn't have out there or what was important to them to have out there. This was, again, at that kind of year of the protest, there was a pamphlet circulating from Egypt about how to protest around Mubarak. And some of the objects you can see on the top right that were listed in this pamphlet about how to protest were like sneakers, a rose, a pot lid to use as a shield, and a spray can to spray on the windows of police cars, and a hoodie. So I made all of those objects as real objects, but transparent so that they could be photogrammed. So this is just kind of for your vocabulary as far as where my thinking about this work comes from. The hoodie itself ends up embodying protest on some level at this time. I've also worked with other kinds of issues around migration and objects that come with those narratives. And then two more brief projects of my own before I get back into Uzbekistan. I was in Russia on a Fulbright in 2018 to examine and kind of resurrect, in a way, Meyerhold's biomechanics, because working with muscle memory so much in terms of these reenactments in the darkroom, I had really not seen or connected to another artist who used muscle memory to the same extent. And when I saw these biomechanics, which were actions that break down a particular movement, like shooting the bow, would become a multi-step thing that you remember in your body, and that because it's broken down and stylized, you therefore can't transcend in quite the same way that you would in a normal acting scenario. And the audience can't either. Even though these were meant as acting exercises, he brought them onto the stage to some extent. And so the audience could not transcend and would therefore be, better revolutionaries. They'd be more aware of their of what's going on in front of them and not just kind of give all their energy to the play. So I went to Russia and worked with a bunch of young actors to talk about security. We're talking about what's personal security and what's state security. And we kind of mapped out a series of exercises around a central audience with these modular props. And it was all kind of a living seminar. So they wore costumes. So you can kind of see that a lot of the work is participatory, it's performative, it's trying to use the body to and kind of cross-cultural strains of art histories, in order to really begin to understand something too big to understand. Security, huge issue. How can we break that down with our bodies and our stories? So we did that there. This is what the set looked like. And I came back to Los Angeles, where I had a show with my dealer at the time, who had just transitioned genders, and her community in LA had lost its kind of gathering place. There was a bar that had closed, and so everybody wanted to remember this bar. So a lot of what I do is work with people's memories, and a lot of it does end up having to do with mapping. If you're trying to remember a space, how do you remember it? You map it, right? So these people would draw these floor plans of, where was the pool table? Where was the dance floor? Where was the pole dancer? Where was the guy who took your money for your car? And I recreated the space with, again, all of the objects in kind of transparent material so that it could make photographs more easily, or photograms. And then we used it as a club, so that at least over the course of the show, it could be fun, it could be enjoyed, and then it could produce more artwork. We don't need the song. One last project of my own to build this narrative of what I do and how I do it. The Vende Museum in Los Angeles, Cold War archive, has a really fantastic collection of work from all over the world from that period. And they always ask artists to activate it. You should do a residency there. I chose to work with this painting at this moment. It was a painting of women building a huge mural of Lenin's head out of flower petals. And this was right when quarantine had begun. We're all isolated, and I'm staring at this thing and I'm thinking, like, in what do we have faith like this now? Even if this was forced faith or whatever kind of faith it was, to make a mural of somebody's head out of flower petals, somebody has to believe in that. And I could not imagine sitting alone in my apartment what we could possibly have that kind of faith. So I asked all of my similarly quarantined professors to ask their similarly quarantined students, and they all came up with these answers that I put together into a score and had quarantined choir alone sing it in the key of like B flat major or something. And they had ideas, and then I made a video of like flower petals putting together these different colors. Their ideas were like, I have faith in my father and Bjork and the death spiral of late stage capitalism, like, just all the ideas, none of them the same. So it was an interesting exercise, again, kind of counter-institutional narratives.
One cannot.
That's enough. So here we are at the end of that. I've read this. I've read about Langston Hughes' trip to Uzbekistan. I've read his journals online at Beinecke at Yale. I've seen these beautiful poems that he left in Uzbekistan that Kevin Young had translated. One of which begins, "You don't have to believe me," and that was the name of the project when I started. And then, I'd seen all these pictures of his gatherings with Central Asian writers, read the play by Umarjan Ismailov from Uzbekistan, and read Langston Hughes' play that is parallel to it. And then I took off on this trip. This is like 5 months after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was like a year after quarantine restrictions were lifted, less than a year after the Taliban moved back into power in Afghanistan, and not long after the January 6th riots here. So I let myself just take pictures with my iPhone, which I don't always do when I'm in a project. I've worked cameralessly for a long time because of that dynamic between, the taker of the photograph and the subject, the author and the subject. But in this case, I thought, since the project was miming the ethnographic gaze on some level, I would let it happen. So I was looking at Lenin's head in the flea markets and Ikat Mickey and COVID lunch scenarios that were still up. But this was not long after a large-scale boycott of Uzbek cotton. And because of that, a lot of the young people that I was meeting who were going to be doing these interviews with their families and talking to them about their family's history, a lot of them had not gone to the field. None of the young people had gone to the fields. And so for them, it was really about getting to know their elders' experiences that they hadn't really talked about as much. And yet I saw that cotton was, completely pervasive in the porcelain by the side of the road in the markets. And I started to ask, as part of these interviews, like, for imagery that they associated with the era, their family members associated with the era during which they had picked cotton, harvested cotton, and songs. And so you can see the kind of shifts in culture over time. You start with this very kind of scientific, documentary kind of image with this music.
Орленок, орленок, взлети выше солнца, и степи с высот огляди.
Very Soviet music. But some of the people, of course, are singing more personal Tajik songs to me. with more personal photographs that they associate with it. And she said that she used to sing that song in the bus, the bus out to the fields. So a lot of people had very personal memories of music. And then as time goes on, you see that, it's no longer the first or the second so much. It's German punk or VHS cameras. Again, I'm not going to make you listen to the whole song, but you can already hear with like 2 bars that culture is changing over time. And yeah. You can also see the shifts in terms of the way the youth are kind of handling the field from the beginning when it's like measuring to this end where this is like a fight. These girls like start pushing each other and it's much more casual, which is what ended up emerging in the stories. And we did some photogram sessions, like using people's bodies to reenact things on site at the Ilkham Theater in Tashkent. And it was trying to do some of the cyanotype work right onto ikat cotton fabric there with the stories in Cyrillic on it. There was a fire at the Ilkham, and so a lot of it burned up, which is fine. The artifacts of this performance were less crucial to me than this, dynamics themselves. But I did come back and want the work to tell the story a little bit more kind of legibly for people who didn't speak Cyrillic or hadn't been there. So I began to make these collages. This one's called First Love, and it's from 1987. So this woman, Irina, this is a surrogate for Irina, was talking about how this man who had just gotten back from the Afghan war, he's an Armenian soldier. He, all the girls loved him. He knew life. And yet he paid attention to her and taught her to drink cognac. So she was having a great time, but she also was reporting on having paid locals to do the work for her. And you can see that I'm using the cyanotype very differently than the way in which the brown photographs I showed you at the beginning. They're carefully painting emulsion over the surface of a piece of paper. It's photosensitive emulsion, right? I am using a spray gun. In the other room, you can see the way the colors mix. In this case, it's deliberately stripy. And in a way, what I'm trying to do there is what Meyerhold did on stage, right? Break that transcendence. So I am a reliable narrator, but I'm not a first-person narrator. And I just want to make sure that in the making of these things, it's not a documentary image and that I am not an objective narrator. The stories continued. This one was from 1976. A woman named Dinara who lived in Tashkent, and she talked about how actually this one was really interesting because her daughter told the story first, and then the mother told it from her perspective. But in any case, they were being asked to pick the cotton way into the winter, and there was really not that much cotton left. It was all frozen. But the boys on her trip, so if you looked at that from an institutional perspective, you'd be thinking about, corruption or human rights. And depending on which kinds of kind of propagandistic images you'd see out there, it would be, trying to make the cotton look big, or if you wanted to stop it, trying to make the exercise itself look dangerous. But her memory, the one that I really fixated on, was that, and you can barely see it in the slide, but that these 2 guys on horses saw the frosty fields and didn't want her and her friends to be uncomfortable. So they rode their horses through the field to melt the snow. These kinds of memories, first love, melting snow because of a gesture of a horse, they matter. And I wanted to privilege them as opposed to the kind of black and white of good, bad, one regime or another. because, you know, the human laborer at the end of the day is someone who's picked that cotton under imperialism, socialism, and capitalism, and yet has very little say in their own representation. So this one was about a woman who picked cotton, got sick, left for the city to get taken care of, and then was kicked out of the Komsomol as a result. So you can kind of see her in her bed at the hospital and running away there. And this one was, it's called Sad Farmer. And it's about this kid from Tashkent also, who went out with his friends to pick the cotton, but they were breaking all the stalks, and the farmer was very sad and cried because he realized that these guys had broken all of his cotton stalks, which would have been productive for another 3 years. And the young man told me that he learned the value of hard work. He would never step on wet paint after this, all this kind of stuff. But it was just another one of those urban-rural kinds of divides that I really feel like I need to look into more closely. So then I started to go to Mexico, 2 hours east of my house. I drive out there all the time to make these similar prints, similar kind of questions around what people shared: tortillas, beans, beer, radio. To look at strikes that happen there in archives. We have archives of images of strikes on the cotton fields. And on the right here, you see a picture from the Mexican harvest, and a couple of other elements of the project that have kind of cropped up over time, including like cotton picking bags for different sized people. That one's called Family Business. And then these are just a series of portraits of Black Americans that went to Uzbekistan either at the invitation of the state or otherwise. Eslanda Robeson, Audre Lorde, Angela Davis, and Langston Hughes. There are many more than that who worked on cotton science and stuff, but these were some kind of visitors. And to kind of finish up, in Mexico, primarily, not as much in Uzbekistan, I've been making video now of the kind of ecological consequence on our border. This is actually on the American side. That's me walking. And I would just kind of walk the length of these different, we have the Laguna Salada, which is dry, as you see here. We went out, and this is the Salton Sea, which is basically just a salt mess. And then this is the Laguna Salada, where my Mexican colleagues and I just went to make rain, and you might be able to hear it. So we made a rainstorm with our bodies as kind of the last gesture that we'll do together for this project on the Mexican side. If you close your eyes, it really does sound like rain. So that's what I brought. I hope that helps flesh some of it out, but please ask questions. And Madison, maybe you kick us off.
I would love to. Hello, everybody. I'm super excited to be talking about this work and to be chatting with Farrah. One thing that comes up for me in each iteration of each project is this relationship between the self and the other, and the self representing the other in a particular way. So whether it's the picking cotton for a feudal government versus for oneself and one's own community, or the institutional or governmental media telling the story, or even the artists that are hired for the government versus telling one's own story. And also, as you were mentioning this, there's also the way that the urban versus rural also is kind of telling each other's stories. And I'd love to start this convo by telling us a little bit about your orientation to telling these folks' stories, because there is a way that you are telling the story. There's an interpretation, there's a mediation, visually, right? You're depicting somebody else's story, and I think it's such a lovely way of bridging this kind of chasm in intergenerational transmission, that there's these family stories or these cultural stories that exist in visual culture and in everyday life, but that aren't getting passed down in families necessarily. So you're kind of giving bones to it. And I'd just love to hear about your experience kind of doing that translation.
Yeah. In this project specifically, one of the methods, and I wonder, if anyone has a response to the experience of seeing the first love with the stripes, or the experience of seeing the spray gun of the cyanotype, that is meant to suggest a hand or a presence of another person. I really don't want anyone thinking that like I am an insider, and that is my gesture towards that. I think that there's just too much of a loaded history with outsiders coming in and shooting these events for money or otherwise. I do feel implicated in both countries' narratives. I mean, I'm from Southern California. I benefit from the water that is taken from that side of the border. Two of my grandfathers both of my grandfathers were from the Soviet Union, Armenia, and Ukraine. And again, I feel like no project really has an us or a them. What I'm trying to do is suggest mutual implication, and yet acknowledge that I'm working from a really particular place. Like I'm here, I'm trying to tell this. You don't have to believe me. Is why the project was initially called that. Because there are many people narrating the story with me, Yeah,
I love this collaborative storytelling, and I think it's especially powerful in the ways that you've collaged the images in the cyanotypes, in particular, because sometimes it looks very similar. The scale is right, the perspective is right. It looks like an image that we could recognize in the world. But in fact, when we spend a little bit more time, there are these small differences. And I feel like I'd love just to hear you say a little bit more about those and kind of how those small differences, that same kind of, wait, something's not quite, wait, there's a gap there, or and the way that this kind of informs the project as well.
Yeah, and definitely deliberate. Like, I like things to be credible, but definitely to give you pause after a second take. It's part of it is just not to fetishize the final result. I mean, like the video we just made in the Laguna Salada. It's supposed to be just an exercise and a first take and a practice run to hear what sounds would happen if we tried to make rain with our bodies. So I didn't tell them initially that like I like it better than our final plan, which is to instrumentalize children and take them out to the lake to make no, it's actually going to be really lovely to use all of these young students out there. But I loved it that none of us knew that we might end up in a video. We all wore just whatever. We were practicing different kinds of ways of making sound. And so there's something very improvisational about doing that, that ends up still sounding like rain. And similarly with the collage, it looks like, the sad farmer's here and the young bad cotton harvester is here. They look like they're in the same space, but certainly there's a break in perspective in the center of it. And I could have corrected that, but I felt like it was enough. It was enough for you to register the narrative and then to have that moment of second guessing the story's origin or how it's being relayed to you. Yeah.
I love that. I'm curious how, or if you've heard how the folks who have told these stories think about these, or what their experience is with the images that you've created.
Yeah, well, they haven't seen this incarnation, but we did at the Ilkham Theater have an opening night for the ones that we had done on the ICAT, which was with the same stories. And we had an open mic and we had a performer who kind of enacted, somebody sang, somebody danced, and then we had the video of the different songs and vernacular video playing there. So yeah, every time I do a project like this, as with my former dealers club, I really want it to be there for the community that made the story. That's their story, so they should have fun with it. A lot of social practice artwork doesn't necessarily, or it doesn't have to consider fun as a part of it, nor the audience necessarily as being like the subject and the audience being the subject and the spectator being the same thing, and the most important audience being the subject itself. So yeah, for sure. The first show I had of this was in Uzbekistan, and the first work I do with the Mexican stuff is it's also with them in a book. So yeah, that's very important to me. And now if I take this into a larger exhibition context, I definitely want to bring those other artists' work with me from Uzbekistan and Mexico. But here, we have this small sample in the context of Central Asian Conference. I'm just really excited to see how different audiences respond and what kinds of questions come up, because it's not obvious when you look at it per se, all of these narratives. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that externalization of memory that we're seeing it, that one can see their own memories from a different perspective, really does I think get at the materiality of your work too, and that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the cyanotype as a process, especially from the digital image, the phone image that you're starting from, or the other collage elements, because in some ways there's this, and I hope you'll stick with me for this little thought journey, but I'm thinking about the transmission of intergenerational stories at the heart of this project, right? And how it's kind of moving into the future to give access to these stories and this element of shared culture to younger generations, and how taking photos with an iPhone and then turning them into cyanotypes is in some ways kind of going back in time using experimental processes using early analog processes in a way that's kind of enacting a look backwards. And so I think this is a really interesting intersection.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people who use photograms or these kind of hyper analog techniques are doing it as anachronism on purpose. But I have always, at least for the last, since like 2008, also incorporated the digital and sometimes the 3D model or whatever into the work, because it's not a fear of the future or the present. It is the reason I'm using analog processes, hyper analog processes, and embodied practices is just to get closer to the story. And in the case of cyanotypes, because of the metaphor with the early processes, but also because it just takes sun and water to make them. You did it at summer camp probably with leaves. And so it's ecologically sound and easy to do on the road. But yeah, you're right. Also using iPhones, so in this case, like it's kind of a pain to make them this big with a spray gun, because you're spraying a toxic thing. It's not that toxic. I tell myself, I'm using a spray gun to put it on there in this kind of like one gesture, and then you have to wait for it to dry, and then you have to wait for the circumstance of the sun, or I just built myself finally a UV lamp that's big enough to get to it all, because the sun in San Diego is strong in certain seasons, but there's also wind, and you're very subject to the elements. So you've got this huge piece of transparency you're trying to like keep on top of this big piece of cotton rag paper, and I don't want to battle it anymore, so I built myself an interior thing.
Yes. I love that so much. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit too about the process of the object images, because first of all, they're fantastic, and they really do play, I think, between this kind of advertising rhetoric and this typology that we might expect from a colonial archive or something that is keeping track, categorizing these objects.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned advertising, because like another Western photographer who ended up going into Uzbekistan in 1932 was Lottie Jacobi, and she wasn't as impressed by irrigation and industry in the same way that like Margaret Bourke-White was. Margaret Bourke-White just had developed the technical vocabulary about how to photograph in factories. Like she loved factories, and so that was going to be her shtick. But Lottie went into the same factories and photographed like kids learning to read and like perfume bottles. So when I look at her perfume bottles, I think, object, still life, but also advertisement. And certainly those look like it. They're cameraless as well. They're scans of the object like this, or appropriated from the internet when I couldn't find a couple of those things. But they are meant to look as if they are photographed on, the kind of dark ground of like an iPod ad or something from back in the day when I had to help out with those shoots. Yeah.
So I actually love to hear that you couldn't find some things.
Mm-hmm.
Because one of the things I was wondering about is how you sourced the objects. And you talk about the banalities of everyday life, and I was like, what's more banal than going grocery shopping or for your art, just picking out products? Or so I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of how you got
the first version of them was just like that. Everybody was saying toilet paper and chocolate, and so I just went to the grocery store and got toilet paper. But it was such American toilet paper. It was like so fat and like such a big roll. And I just knew that was not the toilet paper from 19 whatever, in, the rural area outside wherever. And so I looked for more specific toilet paper, checked in with the person who did and they were like, no, it wasn't like that, but that's closer, and so there's an approximation thing that happens. That's the toilet paper was one I got from the internet, an image of it. And the chocolate bar was a real chocolate bar I ordered. The cognac was a real Armenian cognac that I ordered because that's what people were talking about. And then the water bottle, I just wanted it to be transparent so it would make a nice photogram. And that came literally from Ukraine. There's a Soviet water bottle from Ukraine that arrived at my house. So yeah, it's kind of like, again, like with the Egyptian project I mentioned earlier, it's like getting closer to these like objects. My mother sewed the organza hoodie. I sourced the Ukrainian water bottle. And they will never be the object that was discussed or described or remembered, but they can get closer to like a platonic form of hoodie and water bottle that we might all imagine. And sometimes when they're too interesting, they don't work. When the object is too interesting, it's too specific. It needs to be like, that's chocolate,
And also I think that you're amassing these objects and creating this platonic archive, if you will, is really important, because all of the objects that you were sourcing, ordering, buying, finding images of are things that we use up. Like, it really is about, if we share them, then we've used them up. And so there is this way that like consumption and is at the heart of the recreation. That, if you eat, like, I was going to ask if you ate the chocolate bar.
A rat did.
Okay. It was, okay.
It got eaten in my studio. Yep.
Okay. But yeah, I think that, the ways that, not just the stories are kind of being embodied in new ways, but also that these objects are kind of being reinvigorated is super special. And I know that, you've mentioned to me before the way that you conceptualize the negative, especially with digital work. And I think something that, for instance, with the media photo of the shields,
the riot plates.
Plates. Yeah, thank you. And then recreating this with your friends' bodies, and those bodies being almost themselves like the negative, something that can be recreated. And this also came up with the revolutionary actions and the different actions, the bow. And I would love to hear you wax a little bit about the political potential of those as a negative that can be reproduced again and again, limitlessly, that once we kind of get it in our body, this remembered movement, that this can also kind of inform political movement in everyday life.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about mechanical reproduction and the essay from this period around how that's political and a weapon against fascism, maybe we've gone so far into mechanical reproduction that it is now a more complicated argument than it was then, and we are maybe a little bit more responsible to our bodies and our subjectivity to figure out what's true. And so, yeah, I mean, in all of my work, I'm just trying to engage the author, the subject, and the spectator in this game. It's supposed to be fun, of a relay of information, so that nothing is coming from a fixed perspective, and rather than simply receive it as a consumer and hate or like, or believe or not believe, you're part of it one way or another.
It's almost like an exquisite corpse show and tell.
Yes, that's lovely. Let's do that. Let's call it that.
There was something else that I had on the tip of my nose. I would just be curious to hear if there were things that were unexpected in the stories that you received as you were doing these interview processes, and things that you didn't include, things that you thought you might hear, these kinds of contingencies.
Definitely the most surprising elements are usually the ones that I make pictures of, because they're the ones that stick in your mind. They did tell, I have a book of their story. It's not this big, but I have a book of their stories. But the kind of detail that the punctum, if you will, if you got a photo nerd vocabulary, the thing that pricks and stays with you, a la Roland Barthes. Those are the things that I ended up making into pictures myself. But yeah, there are things I haven't yet been able to depict, mostly from the Mexican side. There was one farmer who talked about doing the twist in the cotton fields in the 50s, or not in the 50s, a little later than that, but still. The twist in a Mexican cotton field, it's such a specific, interesting image. And I actually asked AI what it thought that would look like, and it came up with terrible results that didn't make any sense.
That's what came to my mind too. I'm like, I wonder what it would say.
Yeah, it'd be like legs up to here and bodies conjoined. It makes no sense. So maybe I'll try it again in a month and it'll be amazing, because it evolves so fast. But so far AI doesn't know how to deal with that idea either.
I really love that you said, the things that were the things that were the simplest, that really stuck with you the most, are the things that you made the images of, because when I first started learning about this project, and the phrase, the banalities of everyday life, it seems banal, right? But I think it is the intimacies of these objects, of these stories, of what is shared, of how it is shared. I think is anything but banal. I think.
And I don't want it to be, socialist realist stuff makes people look happy while they're working, and I didn't necessarily want these to be like happy moments, as if the fields were just a great place to be. I wanted them to be moments of repose or interiority, because they're people, I didn't even want that. Those are the moments that stuck, because, the institutional picture would either be like, I am producing a lot for the company, or I am so thrilled to be producing a lot for the company, or I am producing a lot for the company, save me. And so to avoid that narrative and talk about the interiority and the personal memory is, for me, the politics of the gesture. I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Because these are humans that are going to work, right? That are doing all this work, that are falling in love, that are thirsty and need a piece of toilet paper or what have you. I love that so much.
Yeah.
Should we open it up for some comments from the audience? Questions?
Yeah. And when people would tell you stories, would they show you photographs?
Sometimes, like that one where the woman singing the Tajik song that she sung on the school bus, she was going through her photographs while she sang to me. I didn't do all the interviews. It was a network of young people who talked to their families, but some of them I was there or did, and a couple of different eras of photographs, and And yeah, they're not like this because a lot of times what people take pictures of is like group shot. Like we are here together, like this is our cohort or our class or whatever. That's a really typical vernacular photograph that we know from our own lives as well. So they didn't have a lot of pictures like this. It's the kind of unphotographed moment because nobody, also because no iPhones, right? So like earlier generations not having constantly photographed lives. But you can see even in the VHS tapes from the 80s and 90s that there is a different kind of attitude towards personal life out there that cameras are starting to pick up on and record.
Yeah, I guess it strikes me as like an interesting facet of the cameralessness of your photographs, that are like from a historical moment or from a geographic place where having a camera for those moments, they weren't photographed at the time, right? And the other thing I was going to say, and also I like how using this cyanotype as this kind of like general historical process takes out some of that, like, oh, that photograph looks like it's from the 70s, or oh, that photograph looks like it from the 80s. And that kind of like aesthetic of photography that we associate with particular moments into a more generalized.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. I'm going back in a couple of weeks, as I said, to the Fergana Valley to look. It's a residency sponsored by the Swiss, the Germans, and the Ministry for Climate and Ecology. There's an interesting mix of funders that speaks to the current kind of multipolar situation over there. And I really I chose the Fergana region because I want to go see where the photographs that Alpert and Penson took, where those are situated. I haven't been there before. And I also want to look at Eisenstein's shot list for the movie he never made about the Fergana Canal, and like see if I can understand where exactly, because he made pictures. It's a real shot list. Yeah, but I've never been out there. So each stage of this kind of involves like a meta photographic question where you're just like, I think this was or wasn't photographed, and how and how can I like insert myself back into that stream of reproduction and representation and see what it looks like in a different way with people involved rather than as a documentary person.
Thank you.
Are you planning to document your Eisenstein quest in any way?
I would like to try to, we'll see. I don't know the mix of people that will be with us. So yeah, I mean, it would be super cool to make like in an hour Eisenstein whole film, like yes, shot one, shot two. But I don't know.
This was more of a collaboration. Yes, no, it feels again, like collaborative storytelling.
Yes, I would like to do that with him.
Love it.
Yeah. So I know this was very much an art talk, but I don't know if anyone has any kind of questions about the context or the any other. Yeah.
You mentioned that at the beginning was Langston Hughes.
Yeah.
For reading Langston Hughes. What triggered your interest
In Langston
Did you
Hughes?
have visuals when you were reading it, and how far they were, kind of what you saw was different? I understand they use very different time, but
Yeah.
And the second one, I'm not I have nothing to do with art.
Yeah.
So it would be
Yeah.
a very kind of super naive
No.
question. Cotton is very kind of aesthetically kind of nice, right?
Mhm.
That's why it's used everywhere, right?
Mhm.
Porcelain and,
Mhm.
and all that. And you have parts of it, like the imagery. To what extent the kind of the beauty of cotton kind of was part of your project? Was it or not?
Yeah. Well, to start with the first question, it was again during quarantine that I was reading Langston Hughes' autobiography. And when was that? 2019. 2020, like the beginning of 20, my father had just died. I'm alone in quarantine in a city. I don't know anybody. I'm reading this memoir, and I'm enjoying living with Langston, and and then he starts going on trips that I've taken. Like he went to Cuba, he did all these trips, and then he goes to Moscow, and he has this really strange experience with the play. He has a great experience, but at the same time, the play, which I then got from a library in Russia, because it was like, this sounds crazy, this play, and it is crazy. It's like a Marx flag coming over the hill at the Civil War in the U.S. to like solve the problem. It's very not the dynamics you would expect about black and white dynamics in the U.S. Anyway, so he goes through, as I said, to Central Asia, and I was just kind of like stuck in my tracks by the faith that he had in the potential of the system, and now I have really looked at the next 3 generations of Black Americans that went over there with different kinds of projects, and Margaret Bourke-White, 1932 was a moment when it was still possible to go over there with no questions asked, there's a cool project happening here. There's an experiment, a social experiment happening here. There were already some signs that things were changing for people, obviously, by the time, a couple years later, some question about how Rodchenko was photographing in Kazakhstan and not seeing some of the things that were happening there. But in 1932, on the path Langston Hughes was taking, he was really impressed, and I had been to Russia a few times and kind of been embedded already in this question of political faith from Meyerhold and the revolution, and that interwar period where the faith is potentially sincere, I just wanted to go back and ask this really human question as a worker myself. We are all workers. Your labor is the same, really, under all of these regimes that for us as historians or thinkers about political philosophy are very different regimes. And they should affect your labor differently. And I'm sure they did affect the labor differently. But really, at the end of the day, you're still picking the cotton. So tell me about your experience. Because I guess that's what I have faith in. Now it's the only thing really is the personal story as testimony. Yeah. So I mean, it's that same moment when I was making the Lenin flower piece and really just thinking about faith a lot. What do these kids in quarantine believe in, and what does Langston believe in, and what do I believe in, and then let's go see what they believe in. I actually asked that question in the interviews as well, but nobody answered it. They really just wanted to tell personal stories. Yeah. Yeah.
So, as an artist from a post-Soviet country, using Lenin as a symbol in art is like a edge. It's like a thin bridge where you walk, and I'm really interested in what it feels for you to use this symbol in your art. Does it tell specific story, or it's like a part of a big story? I
didn't use the image,
and also from a foreigner standpoint, how does it feel?
Right. I didn't use the Lenin head. That was the original painting.
There was a cyanotype, no?
With that one. That one is an interesting little moment in one of the caravanserai in Bukhara, where this guy was selling fans. If you look at the picture, there's a plastic fan, there's a couple of other older things, and then he had this really old flag, red flag, of course. And in color, it was actually one of the only ones that I didn't know if I liked in cyanotype, because you can't quite see the age of the flag. And to me, the real feeling, the Ikat Mickey, that works. as a cyanotype. You don't need the color necessarily, although the color does something specific there too. But definitely with the flag in the market, when it is in color, you can really see the age and the different materials in the room. So like the kind of crappy plastic of the fan and the like regalia of that flag. And so for me, that picture was about this man's collection, his collection. But I am less comfortable showing pictures. I mean, I haven't exhibited those, but I am less comfortable showing pictures of what I saw than I am of the participatory artwork, because that feels like more collaborative. Those pictures I like having, and I haven't taken them out of the body of work yet, or probably won't, because they do position the project in a moment in time. And I think that that's what that one in particular does. It positions the moment in time at which I was there. So Lenin is not current at this moment in time. It's in basically a vintage store. So it's called Vintage Lenin, that one.
Are there a lot of works that you are not going to show, or you're less comfortable to show? Are there a lot of them?
No, I mean, I don't want to say what would be in a show eventually. It would be for a conversation with a curator and also with the artists from the two countries that I feel like have a different perspective on it as insiders. So, there are some really interesting material investigations in Mexico around the beauty of the cotton plant. But maybe less fetishized as like an icon, and more like there's this one guy I love his pictures. He takes the cotton and makes these kind of like almost minimalist sculpture of them, and then redoes it. So the photograph kind of just becomes an artifact of these like temporary sculptures of cotton. I didn't answer your question, but yeah, I gave the cotton bowl space in some of them when it seemed integral to the narrative, but I didn't like privilege it over other aspects of the stories. So to me, I've been hoping to show with other artists, but that's kind of a big show. And so it would need the right institutional space. And I've asked a friend in Mexico City to think about it. I think having a context in which people maybe already have the conversation started around socialism. I mean, this didn't just happen on the US border and the Uzbek situation. It was worldwide after the US Civil War. People, superpowers looked for cheap land and labor and planted cotton in Africa and India and like all these different places. And so it is a narrative that's larger, but I feel most implicated in these two spaces. So I'm limiting it to that for me. But yeah, my ideal show would include the artists that I've talked to and worked with, as well as my kind of synthesis, if that's what it is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. I'm also similar as Nargis said, I'm quite far from the art, but it was very interesting to hear this like that you mentioned that you try to be participatory and be collaborative, and also two other things that you've mentioned that kind of prompted my question is that you said that you work with the people's memories, and then when you create this art, you try to also be mindful that you are not the first person who like experienced that you are a storyteller. And tie this to the kind of sometimes participatory nature of those projects. I wondered if people reacted to that, like if, I don't know, like if people who you worked with or you kind of portrayed, if you showed them what you created, because I'm a researcher and I did start collaborative projects when it's kind of, when they read what you wrote, it's quite an interesting process how people react. And I've had quite interesting experiences with that, how they understand what you understood from the collaboration.
Yeah, that's she asked that as well, and so the first show of the work was there with them at the Ilkham Theater in Tashkent.
But is it like
Not all of the interviewees
not-
could be there. Some of them could be there, but all of the interviewers were there. So all of the connections to the families were there, and then other people who had simply gone out and picked, and so they could kind of look at their experience. I mean, there's always an ethical issue in photography. It's never right. And there's always somebody, even if you think you're mapping your identity completely onto, like, it's just a self-portrait or something. It's just you. It's still a female body of this age, of this skin, at this time in this room. And so the more I feel like I can reveal of the questions around those ethics in an artwork, and then the more I can also bring those questions back into the room with the participants, the more it's not useful, but it's just more. It cultivates more of a sense of like, why are we doing this? It's not just to be pretty. I don't want to make a picture of, somebody having a picnic on the cotton fields to be pretty. I really am hoping that for them, it's asking the same kinds of life questions that I'm asking about my own life. And most of my projects are surrogate projects. When I use my own body, it's usually the most abstract. It's mostly like, those are the ones that are about like time, because I can feel my body changing in time. But when I'm working with other people around stories, like I have another project I'm working with historical figures in midlife, and I'm totally working out my own stuff through these kind of surrogate narratives. But I also want to make sure that these narratives, like a novel, it's more like creative nonfiction. If I put myself into this narrative as a first person narrator, acknowledge my place in this story, and yet you read it, are you seeing yourself or not? And so, yeah, it's a test. It's a test, really. A show should be like a test. It's not just like a product. It's an experiment, and you don't necessarily pass every time with every piece. And I love that. It should be like a seminar where
Actually, that's I think I didn't formulate my question well, but really I didn't formulate my question. I wanted to ask about pretty. Actually.
Yeah.
What is the kind of role and place of pretty?
Yeah.
In the art you're creating,
Mm-hmm.
because it is about the story and it's very personal and it's great.
Mm-hmm.
I love it. But it is a kind of it is art, right? It is there for enjoyment, and the images are pretty. They're very pleasing, right? Like so you want to be kind of authentic, right? But and not cliche, not like conventional, whatever, right? But so. Yeah. What is it?
I think beauty is important. I think the sublime is more important. You got pretty, you got beauty, you got sublime. And I think, shooting for pretty is kind of like, I need a prom dress or something. It's not what I'm after. I think I am after the kind of a little bit of the kind of like offness of the sublime. I wouldn't call these sublime, but the kind of offness of a real sense of attraction to something, which maybe isn't the same as the sublime, but I'll say attraction to something. So it's not the perfectly made up photograph that's glistening, and I don't think we have one in here, but it's not photoshopped to be. It's photoshopped, but visibly, and then it's cyanotyped, but visibly, and so it's just stopping short of faking it, so that there's something pleasant about the proportions. You can tell that we are advening and we're getting close to reality, and the colors are attracting, but you are, my intention is to like break that fourth wall, as it were, and can it still be pretty? Can it still be beautiful? And I think so. I mean, I think there are a lot of artists who would argue against that, but you see the range in art where, people really want it to be conceptual and didactic, conceptual or didactic. Langston Hughes' play, very didactic. Nobody liked it. It was a phase of his production where he didn't do a lot of publishing. People didn't understand why, his writing had shifted. They wanted him to stay in the vernacular Black American voice. And he was listening for, poetry and in everyday sounds here. And then he went over there and he was listening for everyday sounds as well. And what are the vernacular sounds of collectivizing farms? And what is the literature that's being made? And what did he pick up on? It was very much Soviet didactic theater. And so that's the poetry he wrote, that's the plays he wrote. I think it's part of any project is figuring out what is the right form and voice that's going to both attract and yet just repel enough that you can see it's also critical. I guess that's just who I am also. Some people are like always immersed in their experience and not having that kind of critical constant voice, but I have both all the time. Yeah. Thanks for your questions. Any last gasps? Yeah. And I again thank you for your patience with what was really an art talk. If I probably won't be going through my personal prior work when I give the lecture on Sunday to the conference, but if there's any kind of more specific information about the context that you think would be interesting for me to add in for that lecture, anyone, let me know afterwards. Yeah.
Thank you all, and big thanks to Farrah. It would be fantastic if you would all join us for a little reception just right here.